Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Journey of 1,000 Li, Introduction to Chinese Philosophy. When we embark on a trip, we typically have a destination in mind. Setting off each morning on the way to work or jetting off for a vacation, the aim is to get to the destination. But have you ever wandered without a purpose, intending simply to enjoy whatever you come across? In this scenario, your experience of the journey, rather than the journey's destination, is the focal point of the activity. The Chinese concept Dao may refer to both, either the journey's end or, in contrast, a journey with no fixed itinerary. The travel metaphor expresses the different ways early Chinese thinkers thought about how best to live. Some, like the Confucians, proposed a vision of a good life, a destination, so to speak, that we should all aspire to reach. Others, such as the Taoists, did not emphasize specific life goals, but instead advocated letting our engagement with the world shape our next steps. Speaking of next steps, we are now taking some of our own, as the podcast moves on to consider the history of philosophy in China. In the dozens of episodes to come, we will encounter philosophical questions raised by early Chinese thinkers and find that they were far from reaching unanimous agreement about those questions. Yet they did converge on some shared concerns. Early Chinese texts that inform our views of Chinese philosophy, starting from the late 5th century BCE, actively explored humanity's place in the world. They asked what makes us distinctively human, such as our ability to interact and collaborate with others and to care for others appropriately. They discussed which goods humans should pursue. Some proposed visions of a flourishing society, while others placed more weight on individual initiative. These texts convey the early Chinese awareness of the embeddedness of humanity in the cosmic, natural, and political worlds. The question of how we orientate ourselves in the world was primary to these thinkers, though as they recognized, it may not be a question that can be settled once and for all. The early Chinese also believed that the world is constantly undergoing changes and transformations. Some would say this is a unique feature of Chinese philosophy across its different traditions. In fact, that will be the topic for the second episode in this series. The challenge of learning to thrive within a dynamic, changing world is one that underlies much of Chinese philosophy. As they rose to that challenge, various Chinese traditions debated ideals and values, and also discussed how individuals could cultivate themselves to develop capabilities for navigating the world. In this series, we will be looking especially at the Confucians, the Moists, the Taoists, and the Legalists, while also touching on the views of lesser-known thinkers up to and including the period of Chinese Buddhism's early development over the latter half of the Han period, which ran from 206 BCE to 220 CE. To begin our exploration of Chinese philosophy, let us return to the idea of Tao, which comes up in a number of these traditions. We look first at Confucianism. You may be familiar with criticisms of Confucian philosophy as traditionalist or even as advocating authoritarianism. We will need to reckon with such accusations in due course, but whatever one decides about them, it has to be said that there is much more to Confucian philosophy than that. Confucian philosophy, of course, traces its origins to the philosopher usually known as Confucius, born in 551 BCE. We will call him by his real name, Kong Tzu, but for convenience still use the adjective Confucian to describe the tradition. The Confucians were optimistic, believing that the resources for morality lie within humanity. The early Confucians lived during a time when manual labor was the primary and only way of life for the vast majority of people, including for men, women, and children. Thus, it is striking that, during a time when life was difficult and society unequal, they believed that everyone, without exception, had the capacity to live moral lives. Of course, in practical terms, not everyone could become a learned gentleman, much less a king. However, the point that Confucians were making was not about status, but about a person's moral capacities. The Meng Tzu, a Confucian text from the 4th century BCE, makes this claim boldly: "The sage and we are the same in kind." The Confucian Tao is built on a conviction that our moral capacities are valuable resources for a flourishing society. When properly harnessed and developed, these capacities can help us lead better lives. The Confucian vision includes a hierarchically organized society, a view most of us would hesitate to accept today. However, Confucian philosophy also holds that only those with firm moral commitments should be models for others. In attaining this vision, institutions are key, not institutional buildings or organizations, but practices that help us interact better because they incorporate and express benevolence in our interchanges. And that's an idea we still have today. Consider the concept of duty of care in contemporary law. Although the practicalities associated with this concept vary from country to country, the basic idea is that people in specific positions or occupations are responsible for putting in place measures that help ensure, as far as possible, the safety or well-being of others who are under their care. For example, the kindergarten teacher should make sure there are no hazards in the play area, and the doctor should make sure the patients are receiving the right treatment. Such professions develop sets of practices to ensure that the duty of care is fulfilled. These might be explicit and elaborate, like the regulations at a hospital, but they can also be informal, even unconscious, like using a gentle tone of voice when speaking to a kindergarten child, or adopting a sympathetic facial expression when giving bad news to a patient. These sorts of practices, developed to implement the idea of duty of care, aim at benevolence. For the Confucians, the Tao consists above all in creating and following just such practices. They emphasize that the practices of benevolence cover many aspects of life, including our interactions with family members, as well as the measures taken by governments for the welfare of the people. Morality is made possible through institutions that have been developed by morally enlightened leaders. For people in a society to follow tried and tested Taos helps bring people together cohesively in their shared practices. As we will see in later episodes, the Confucians thought deeply about the processes and support necessary for developing our moral capacities in order to establish a benevolent society. The Confucian Tao is thus a closely monitored journey with a specific destination, which offers a contrast from what we find in Taoist philosophy. In general, Taoist philosophy promotes a more open-ended approach to a good life. Of course, the concept Tao gives Taoism its name, which can be a bit confusing, given that, as we just saw, other groups like the Confucians do also use it. But the name is not inappropriate since Tao does have a unique place in Taoism. One way to think about Tao in this tradition is to understand it as a generative and sustaining source. The Tao De Jing, a text compiled prior to the 2nd century BCE, says that Tao is muddied yet complete, prior to heaven and earth, and mother of all things. In this passage at Tao De Jing, chapter 25, we are also told that Tao is unnameable because it encompasses the entirety of all beings, entities, forces, energies, spaces, and void. But Tao is neither a final state nor an ideal one, according to which the places of each of the myriad things are mapped out. Rather, all things continue in an ongoing, dynamic, transformative process. It is because Tao encompasses things, known and unknown, which are ceaselessly interacting, that it is said to be without name, Wu Ming. Another way to think about the Taoist Tao takes us back to the idea of Tao as an open-ended journey. Imagine going out for a walk without a destination. Of course, you may decide to walk in the bush or forest or in a particular part of a city, but you're not aiming to get anywhere in particular. You might end up going to a cafe for a while, booking some tickets for a concert that evening, taking a nap in a shady spot, having a drink with a friend, or popping your earbuds in to enjoy your favorite philosophy podcast. These decisions are made on the spot, as it were, depending on what you might encounter during your walk. The idea that there is no fixed itinerary opens up room for self-directed actions. On such a journey, we respond to circumstances as they arise in the moment. Not having to keep track of where we are with respect to a destination, we may act more spontaneously. The idea of spontaneity is often used in connection with the Taoist word wu wei. Wu wei may be understood as taking actions that are not directed, whether by others or according to predetermined goals. It concerns the nature of our engagement with the world. According to this view, Taoist philosophy creates space for our attentiveness to circumstances, especially as no destination is set. Walking along a road to explore what it may bring is part of this idea, but so also is the opportunity to make new roads. On this point, it makes sense to say that the Tao is unnameable. You do not want to lock in exactly where you are heading by naming a destination or an activity, and you cannot prescribe paths for others. How far can we go with this conception of the Tao within Taoism? The Shuangzi, a Taoist text whose composition began around the 4th century BCE, speaks of wandering. The very first chapter is entitled Carefree Wandering, Xiao Yao You, and contains stories and anecdotes about encountering a diversity of perspectives and responding to circumstances as they arise. But some may find that they are not really open to this degree of open-endedness. Those who find uncertainty challenging, whether in relation to ourselves or society more generally, will find this picture unappealing. While wandering without a destination might be an enjoyable way to spend a day or two now and then, could we live this way most of the time or across our whole lives? Is it possible for us to have a general idea of a good life without planning to attain specific targets related to that idea or ideal? Perhaps that is too extreme an understanding of this philosophical approach. The idea of Tao as an open ended journey need not be understood as a recommendation to have absolute freedom in all our undertakings. Taoist philosophy does not exclude walking along the paths that others have recommended to us, or traveling along them part of the way. Maybe the reason I'm walking in this neighborhood is that my friend mentioned it is a nice place for a stroll. And maybe the reason I choose to listen to this particular podcast is that my friend has impeccably good taste and has recommended it to me. But equally, Taoism focuses on looking for opportunities to veer from the paths made by others. Then too, while an aimless walk offers limitless opportunities, in practical terms, the decisions we make are based on our interests and our dispositions, as well as what is available to us at a particular point in time. The Zhuangzi's idea of wandering is beautifully captured in the image of a giant bird who flies thousands of miles up in the sky and across vast oceans. Yet the giant bird cannot take flight unless its wings are supported by considerable winds, just as a large boat can be held up only by a great deal of water. Just so, a journey without a map or a goal is not a journey without constraints. If I'm on that walk and think it might be nice to pop into a museum, I may find that it's past closing time. And to be human is to be subject to such constraints. In wandering, we engage our abilities to grasp opportunities as they arise, while knowing that that ability has limits. Our bodily forms, our capacities, and our interdependencies constrain or enable us differently in different contexts. Tall people may reach higher cupboards more easily, but are more likely to bump their heads on a lower door frame. Not that Karen or I would ever have this problem. In sum, the activity of wandering is not entirely arbitrary. In wandering, we become more attuned to the world with respect to our own capacities and limitations as we engage with that world. Openness to the world as it unfolds is at the center of Taoist philosophy. When we embody the Taoist Tao, we engage optimally with the world. A passage in the Tao Te Ching says, "A journey of 1,000 li starts under 1 foot." The passage speaks of our actions in a world that is a happening place. It prompts us to think about how we engage with the world. In Chinese philosophy, there's a third meaning of Tao. It is closely related to the two we've already encountered, Tao as a destination and Tao as an open-ended journey. Here, Tao refers to a method to achieve a goal, be it a teaching or a doctrine or an endorsed set of practices. The Confucian tradition, for one, emphasizes that exemplary people are models for others. Kongzi himself, of course, served that function for his students and for readers of the many stories about him. As with the first two meanings of Tao, Tao in this third sense was used in different ways in the Chinese traditions. For example, the Confucian Tao, or teaching, placed great value on rituals and their correct performance. By contrast, the Moists, named after their founder Mozi, believed that traditional rituals were a waste of time and resources. The Moist Tao was guided by a doctrine, that of acting on the basis of inclusive care so as to maximize benefit for everyone. Both Moist and Confucian Taos incorporated methods to attain their respective aims, and the Taoists were leery of any general set of prescriptions, either for goals or methods, to be followed by everyone. Thinking about Tao as a method or approach also brings to mind the range of arguments and methods of persuasion early Chinese thinkers used to put their ideas across. These include the use of metaphors, imagery, illustrations, precedents, and analogies. In this series, we will of course be discussing philosophical ideas, but we will also consider how these thinkers made a case for those ideas. In many of the texts, we will find little in the way of explicit argument or valid demonstration, but lots in the way of metaphors, illustrations, analogies, or imagery. Frequently, one has the sense that the reader is being invited to think along with the authors. Let's look at a couple of cases of the reasoning strategies used by early Chinese thinkers. To exemplify the use of imagery, we'll take another passage from the Zhuangzi, in fact, another one involving a bird. This is the story of a high official who honored a bird by taking it in his chariot for a temple visit. The bird was presented with a banquet of meat and wine as part of a sacrificial ritual that involved killing an ox, a sheep, and a pig. The poor bird then died within 3 days. This imagery is meant to convey something we just mentioned, the Zhuangzi's criticism of society's promotion of a single set of ideals. Even if well-intentioned, the effort to enrich human lives by promoting a singular Dao impoverishes humanity. The way the bird is fussed over is ridiculous, a vivid example to show the coercive nature of these single ideal projects. Many texts also use illustrations to support their claims. Some of these are anecdotal, that is, they refer to an incident in the past as an example of an action or a disposition that should be emulated, or one that should be avoided. In the Confucian text, the Mengzi, there's a sage king, Shun, who is respected for showing filial devotion to his parents. In fact, Shun's parents and half-brother attempted to kill him by getting him to repair a well and then shutting him in it. The Mengzi uses this anecdote to illustrate Shun's filiality and his virtue, as he remained devoted to them. Now, it's far from clear that this really happened, but that isn't really the point. Often, anecdotes serve to enhance the visibility or accessibility of the point being made. It's not unlike the telling of a joke, which might slip in elements familiar to its intended audience. There's a flip side to this, of course. If the intended audience does not share the comedian's reference points, they will fail to understand the joke, a phenomenon that will be painfully familiar to any middle-aged academic who has tried to teach students who are 20 years younger. And this is a problem Karen and I definitely have experienced. There is potentially more to the use of anecdotes as well in early Chinese texts. They also implicitly demonstrate the author's familiarity with existing motifs, and thereby help to establish his authority, particularly his membership of an in-group. Needless to say, having this information does not make us any more likely to agree with the philosophical point being made. However, it does help us better understand the methods of persuasion and the uses of argument in early China. It's appropriate that we've spent so much of this first episode talking about the meaning of a single word, Dao, because something else that was of great concern in early Chinese philosophy was language and the difficulty of using it well. It should be evident from everything we've said that one common English translation, way, is not entirely misleading, yet also falls well short of expressing its full range of meaning. For Dao is not simply a concept to be understood, it incorporates activity, of traveling along a way. How we do so, by following or engaging or challenging or creating, are our Daos. Moreover, the idea of Dao, whether as expressing a vision of how life should be, or as a doctrine or practice, or in rejecting the imposition of any one model of life for all, needs to be communicated. Indeed, we noted that for the Taoists, Dao is ineffable. It cannot be captured or expressed in words at all. What then is the force of words? We rely heavily on language for so many of our activities. Indeed, life would be unthinkable without language. Through language, we think about and communicate our intentions and preferences, develop and work on projects together, and express our agreement or disagreement with others, and much more. The aforementioned group of thinkers known as the Moists believed that language is an irreducible part of the infrastructure of the human world. Used and harnessed well, it had the capacity to bring order to life and, of course, to be more productive. However, the task of ensuring that language both captures what is in the world and appropriately conveys our projects and goals is immensely complicated. The Moist canons, Moujing, articulate the difficulty of getting language to fulfill these functions, and as we've already learned to expect, does so with an example. Suppose we are trying to differentiate oxen from horses. What do we pick as the distinguishing features of each? The canons speak against arbitrarily picking any feature, such as oxen having teeth and horses having tails, to distinguish the two. The Moist concern was not merely to settle disagreements about the features of oxen and horses, of course. Rather, they sought to ascertain how it might be possible to ensure that words are used reliably. Their project to determine the connection between words and the things in the world the word picks out exposes some intractable problems in our use of language. Whereas language seeks to establish determinate meanings, our lives are constantly on the move. On the one hand, language facilitates our life together, allowing us to flourish. On the other, it draws us into familiar and ingrained ways of life. This is a topic we'll discuss more deeply in due course, but not yet. In the next episode, we will be focusing on another factor that contributes to the inexactness of language, the inevitability of change. As much as we wish to remain on the same path while the going is good, many events are beyond our control. We need to respond, adapt, and move on. Change requires us sometimes to rethink our Daos or to develop new ones, just as you are even now in the process of developing the new habit of listening to the history of philosophy in China.